Aboriginal English is a non-standard variety of English spoken by more than 80% of Aboriginal Australians as their main language. This means that there are probably more than 150,000 speakers of Aboriginal English in New South Wales. This variety of English gets many of its distinctive characteristics from the Indigenous Australian languages originally spoken by the Aboriginal population. At the time of colonisation, some 250 Indigenous languages were spoken in Australia. After the arrival of the British, Aboriginal people were forced to learn English. Many lost their original language altogether, though a number of Indigenous languages are still spoken today, and efforts are being made to strengthen the ones that remain. Aboriginal English has traditionally been heavily stigmatised by majority groups in Australia, and it's sometimes seen as bad or broken English. However, Aboriginal English is just as systematic and rule-governed as any other variety of English, even if it follows slightly different rules from Standard English. Although we talk about Aboriginal English as though it was one thing in this lecture, there are actually different varieties of Aboriginal English spoken in different Aboriginal communities. Some of these varieties are closer to Standard English than others, and different varieties may incorporate different aspects of the local Aboriginal languages spoken in that area. In this lecture, we aim to give an overview of the most common features that are shared by most of these varieties. The characteristic pronunciation of Aboriginal English stems from systematic phonological correspondences between the sound systems of traditional Indigenous languages and the sound system of English. For example, Indigenous languages often do not have fricatives, so the fricatives of English are replaced by stops at the same or almost the same place of articulation. So father is pronounced as pata, where the labiodental fricative f is replaced by the bilabial stop p, and the dental fricative v is replaced by the alveolar stop t. You can see why these replacements happen. F and p have almost the same place of articulation, and so do the and t, but the manner of articulation is different. Aboriginal English has a more elaborated pronoun system than Standard English. This includes making a difference between second-person singular and second-person plural, where Standard English has you for both. Aboriginal English uses you for singular and you mob for plural. It also has dual pronouns, that is, distinct pronouns that refer to just two people, we two, you two, they two, which Standard English doesn't have at all. Aboriginal English has optional inflectional number. That is, if there is some other word in the noun phrase that tells you that the noun is plural, you don't have to add the plural s, although it's possible to do so. In Standard English, the plural s needs to be there, even when it's not necessary for the meaning, because it's clear from other parts of the phrase that more than one entity is referred to. We have to say 3 cats rather than 3 cat, even though, strictly speaking, the s adds nothing to the meaning here, since we can already see from the numeral 3 that we're talking about more than one. In Aboriginal English, the plural s is optional in this kind of context. So, for example, them horse, where them tells you that we're talking about more than one, or them horses are both grammatical in Aboriginal English. Like many other English dialects, Aboriginal English has negative concord, as in, he didn't do nothing. The copula, which is obligatory in Standard English, is optional in Aboriginal English. You can say either she is busy or she busy. Recall that the copula doesn't really have much of a meaning. It just functions to link up the subject and the complement. Many languages don't need a copula to do this, but they can just place the subject and the complement next to each other, like Aboriginal English. Aboriginal English has what is called appositional possession. In Standard English, the way to indicate that someone owns something is with an S on the noun, referring to the owner. that man's car. In Aboriginal English, possession is indicated by using the noun or noun phrase referring to the owner as a pre-modifier to the noun referring to the object owned, that man car. This does not mean that Aboriginal English doesn't have a possessive marker. It just marks possession with a different grammatical construction than what Standard English does, using the possessor noun as a pre-modifier to the possessed noun instead of adding an S to the possessor noun. When bilingual people speak, they often switch between different languages in a single conversation. This is known as code switching. For a long time, code switching was thought to be a sign of poor language competence. It was assumed that people who code switched did so because they didn't speak either language properly, so that they had to switch back and forth in order to be able to communicate. Now we know that code switching in fact requires a highly developed language competence. Not only do you have to know each language well to be able to switch between them at will, you also have to have a sophisticated understanding of the communication situation and of which language is most appropriate or most likely to serve your communicative needs in any given situation. Aboriginal societies have always been multilingual, long before the arrival of English. It was common to speak not just the language of one's own group, but also of one or more neighbouring group. If everyone in a social situation speaks more than one language, then how do you choose which language you speak at any given time? Which language you choose can say something about how you see your own identity in that situation, but it also sends signals about how you relate to the people you're communicating with. Accordingly, systematic rules for language choice exist and are used in Aboriginal communities. Speak one's own language wherever possible. This relates to being true to one's own identity. Always take account of the other participants in the speech situation and modify one's own speech accordingly. So speak in a way that everyone can understand. If the other participants do not all understand one's own language, then use the most appropriate language that everyone can understand. If all else fails, try English. And once the language is chosen, use code switching to fine-tune it according to one's own group identification. So, for example, if you're speaking a language other than your own, use a few words from your own language to show which group you identify with. The other participants in the speech situation. For example, if someone is present who deserves particular respect, use a few words of their language, even if it's not the main language used in the conversation. And also the topic of the conversation. Aboriginal English is an important part of the cultural identity of many Aboriginal people. It's seen as home talk, the kind of speech that lets you express who you are and that expresses the social and cultural categories that are important to Aboriginal societies. However, Aboriginal communities also place great importance on learning to speak and write school talk, that is, Standard English. For many Aboriginal children, Standard English is something they will need to learn in school, not something that they come to school already knowing. It's essential to recognise the value of the student's home language as an additional language resource which has an important function in certain contexts and with certain audiences, rather than seeing it as an inferior form of language that should be replaced by Standard English in all contexts. It's easier for students to understand and accept that Standard English has an important function in certain contexts, such as in school or the workplace, if it's taught as an addition to, rather than a replacement for their existing language resources. On the other hand, an approach which sees Aboriginal English as an inferior form of English, which needs to be corrected, is likely to increase the risk of school failure for speakers of this variety. Literacy training in schools is based on Standard English. If such training is to succeed, it's essential to understand that it presents special challenges for students for whom Standard English is not their first language. It's hard to learn to read and write a language variety which you don't speak.